In the early morning hours of November 13th, 2022, 4 University of Idaho students were brutally slain in an off-campus home in Moscow, Idaho. The victims, 20-year-olds Ethan Chapin and Xana Kernodle, and 21-year-olds Madison Mogen and Kaylee Goncalvez, were found stabbed to death in their beds. Each had sustained multiple stab wounds inflicted with a pretty large knife, according to the Latah County coroner. 2 other roommates in the house survived. One reported hearing cries and, upon opening her door, seeing a masked man clad in black walk past her and exit the home at around 4 a.m. There was no sign of forced entry. The shocking crime scene, a quiet college townhouse turned grisly murder site, left the community in fear and garnered national attention. For weeks, authorities had no named suspect. Investigators worked around the clock, tracing every lead they could find. A critical break came with surveillance footage of a white Hyundai Elantra repeatedly seen near the crime scene at the time of the murders. As the investigation intensified, forensic analysts discovered a leather knife sheath at the scene next to one of the victims' bodies. On that sheath, they recovered a single male DNA profile. Using this DNA and some old-fashioned detective work, police gradually honed in on a suspect. Bryan Kohberger, a 28-year-old PhD student studying criminology at nearby Washington State University, emerged as the prime suspect. In late December 2022, 6 weeks after the murders, a surveillance and DNA trail led law enforcement across the country to Pennsylvania, where Kohberger had driven to spend the holidays with his family. On December 30th, 2022, a SWAT team stormed a quiet residential neighborhood in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania, and arrested Bryan Kohberger at his parents' home in the early hours of the morning. He was taken into custody without incident. Investigators had secretly obtained trash from the Kohberger family residence days prior, finding DNA on discarded items that was later determined to belong to Kohberger's father. This familial DNA sample genetically matched the unknown male DNA found on the knife sheath left at the murder scene. Armed with that evidence, as well as cell phone records, vehicle sightings, and other clues detailed in a lengthy probable cause affidavit, authorities were confident they had their suspect. Bryan Kohberger, who had no prior connection to the victims, was promptly extradited back to Idaho to face charges. In early January 2023, Kohberger was formally charged in Latah County with 4 counts of first-degree murder, 1 for each victim, and 1 count of burglary for the alleged break-in at the home. A magistrate judge ordered Kohberger held without bail, given the severity of the charges and the strength of the preliminary evidence tying him to the crime. The case then moved quickly. Originally, a public preliminary hearing was scheduled for late June of that year, where prosecutors would have had to present evidence to a magistrate to establish probable cause. But instead, prosecutors took the case to a secret grand jury. In May, the grand jury returned an indictment charging Kohberger on all counts, eliminating the need for a preliminary hearing. Kohberger was arraigned on the indictment in Latah County District Court on May 22, 2023. In a brief but dramatic arraignment, Kohberger stood silent. He refused to enter any plea of guilty or not guilty on the charges. In response, Judge John C. Judge, great name by the way, entered pleas of not guilty on his behalf, as required by Idaho law. The judge then set an initial trial date of October 2, 2023 to comply with Kohberger's rights to a speedy trial. At that point, Kohberger faced the possibility of the death penalty if convicted. A prospect soon confirmed when Latah County prosecutor Bill Thompson announced in June 2023 that the state would seek the death penalty against Kohberger. The indictment and not guilty pleas marked the beginning of what was expected to be a long, complex legal journey toward a capital murder trial. Almost immediately after Bryan Kohberger's arrest, the court imposed an unusually broad gag order on the case, prohibiting attorneys, law enforcement, and others involved in the case from speaking publicly about the details of the investigation or the legal proceedings. The purpose of this was to ensure Kohberger's right to a fair trial by reducing the influence of pretrial publicity, of which there was already a lot. As a result, much of the information about the case was kept behind closed doors, with the media only able to report on what had been disclosed in official court filings or via courtroom testimony. As you can imagine though, the media did not remain silent. A coalition of nearly 30 news organizations filed a petition against the gag order, arguing that it infringed on First Amendment rights and the public's right to be informed about the case. In April 2023, the Idaho Supreme Court rejected the petition, holding that the media should have first sought relief in the lower court. This left the gag order in place, and for much of 2023, public knowledge of the case was severely restricted. However, the battle between the media and the court continued, as the issue of pre-trial publicity remained contentious. Despite the legal constraints, the media coalition pressed on, attempting to challenge the gag order even further. In June, a motion was filed to loosen the restrictions, particularly for the victims' families who felt silenced. Judge John C. Judge, again I can't get over how awesome of a name that is, presiding over the case at the time, ruled to keep the gag order largely intact, emphasizing the importance of protecting the jury pool's impartiality. This ruling meant that much of the case remained hidden from public view, even as the court proceedings advanced toward trial. One of the most critical pieces of evidence in the case against Bryan Kohberger was the DNA found on the leather sheath left at the crime scene. Forensic investigators were able to link the DNA on the sheath to Kohberger through genetic genealogy, a cutting-edge method that has been increasingly used in criminal investigations. This technique allowed authorities to trace Kohberger's familial connections, ultimately leading them to his location in Pennsylvania. The DNA match was the linchpin that tied Kohberger to the murders, and the subsequent surveillance and investigation sealed his fate as the prime suspect. The defense, however, immediately challenged the DNA evidence. In pretrial motions, Kohberger's attorneys argued that the use of genetic genealogy to identify him was a violation of his constitutional rights, as this method was essentially an invasive search without a warrant. They also raised concerns about the integrity of the evidence, suggesting that the DNA could have been planted or contaminated during the investigation. This argument was vigorously contested by the prosecution, which maintained that the evidence was legally obtained and was directly linked to Kohberger through a series of meticulously documented steps. In January 2025, a multi-day suppression hearing was held, where both sides presented expert testimony. Judge Stephen Hippler, who took over the case after the venue was moved to Idaho's Ada County, ruled that the DNA evidence would be admissible. He determined that Kohberger had no reasonable expectation of privacy over the DNA left at the crime scene, and that the use of genetic genealogy was legal under Idaho law. This ruling was a significant victory for the prosecution, as the DNA evidence was one of the strongest links connecting Kohberger to the murders and the crime scene. The defense continued to challenge the evidence and attempt to undermine the prosecution's case. They sought to dismiss the indictment on the grounds that the grand jury had been improperly instructed. This motion was quickly denied by Judge Judge, who noted that Idaho law was clear on the standards for an indictment. The defense also filed several motions to limit the media coverage of Kohberger's case, arguing that the constant publicity was prejudicing potential juries. However, the judge allowed cameras in the courtroom, albeit with stricter controls to prevent further bias. As the legal proceedings continued, the defense hinted at an alibi for Bryan Kohberger, suggesting that they had evidence that he was not at the crime scene at the time of the murders. However, they did not specify what that evidence was. This raised questions about the defense's strategy. Would they try and claim that Kohberger was innocent, or would they focus on creating reasonable doubt by pointing to other potential suspects? The defense also filed a motion to challenge the death penalty, arguing that Kohberger's constitutional rights had been violated during the investigation. This motion was denied in late 2024, leaving the death penalty as a possible outcome if Kohberger were to be convicted. Despite these setbacks, the defense's focus remained on avoiding the death penalty. As the trial date grew ever closer, Kohberger's attorneys sought to delay the proceedings, and by the fall of 2024, the trial was postponed to the summer of 2025. This delay gave both sides additional time to prepare for what was still expected to be a lengthy and complex trial. In a stunning turn of events, Bryan Kohberger pleaded guilty to all charges in the Moscow student murders case, averting the long-anticipated trial. On July 2, 2025, Barely a month before the scheduled trial date, Kohberger appeared in an Ada County courtroom and admitted to the killings as part of a plea agreement with prosecutors. The deal, which had been secretly in the works for several weeks, spared him from a possible death sentence. In exchange for his guilty pleas to 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of burglary, the state of Idaho agreed not to pursue the death penalty, instead recommending that Kohberger receive multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole. Kohberger, now 30 years old, spoke in court to affirm his understanding to the agreement. When Judge Hippler asked him, "Are you pleading guilty because you are guilty?" Kohberger replied, "Yes." He went on to answer yes repeatedly as the judge read each victim's name and asked if he had murdered that person. Observers in the courtroom described an emotional scene. Family members of the slain students sobbed as Kohberger calmly acknowledged his responsibility for each life that he took. The plea hearing shed new light on the prosecution's case, as prosecutors outlined for the record the evidence they would have presented at trial. Some of that evidence had been known from prior affidavits, but additional details began to emerge. Prosecutors stated that if the case had gone to trial, they would have introduced the DNA evidence linking Kohberger to the K-bar knife sheath left next to Madison Mogen and Kaylee Goncalvez, including the fact that Kohberger had purchased the same model of knife and sheath on Amazon prior to the murders. The murder weapon itself was never recovered, but the sheath DNA was as damning as any fingerprint. They would have shown surveillance footage of Kohberger's white Hyundai Elantra making passes by the King Road house that night, and presented cell phone tower data indicating that Kohberger's phone was in the vicinity of the victim's home at around the time of the murders, as well as evidence that the phone had been turned off during the likely window of the crime, suggesting an attempt to avoid detection. To support the DNA match, the state had assembled what seemed to be a powerful circumstantial case. They had Kohberger's car, his phone, and online activity pointing toward his involvement, although no one could still speak to an exact motive. Kohberger's guilty plea was accompanied by a brief statement of his own actions. In court, he admitted that he entered the victim's residence at around 4 a.m. on November 13, 2022, with the intent to kill. This appears to be the extent of his confession. Notably, the plea deal did not require Kohberger to explain why he committed the murders, and he offered no further insight into his motives. Even in confessing, Kohberger remained vague about the most haunting question: what would drive a criminology student with no known personal connection to these students to slaughter them in cold blood? That question may never be fully answered, as the plea agreement did not include a requirement for a detailed confession beyond the basic acknowledgement of guilt. Under the terms of the plea, Kohberger faces a sentence of 4 consecutive life terms, 1 for each victim, as well as an additional fixed term for the burglary charge. He will have no possibility of parole, effectively guaranteeing that he will spend the rest of his days in prison. And as part of the deal, Bryan Kohberger waived any right to appeal his convictions or sentences. Judge Hippler carefully explained in court that while the plea agreement's sentencing recommendation is for life in prison, the court is not formally bound to follow it. Technically, the judge could impose a different sentence, for example, making the life sentences concurrent or adding additional years. However, Kohberger cannot withdraw his plea or appeal if the judge deviates, so long as the death penalty is not imposed. In practice, it is expected that the judge will honor the agreement for consecutive life terms. Kohberger affirmed on the record that he understood those terms and that he had not been coerced, and was pleading guilty of his own free will. The plea deal apparently came together quietly behind the scenes. According to a letter later shared by one victim's father, the defense approached prosecutors to request a deal, and after negotiation, Kohberger agreed to plead guilty and forego any future appeals. Some legal experts were surprised the state would settle, given the considerable evidence in their favor. One veteran capital defense attorney told CBS News that she was mystified that prosecutors agreed to take death off the table only a month before trial, speculating that perhaps the state had some concern, or simply decided to spare the victims' families the ordeal of a trial and decades of appeals. Prosecutor Bill Thompson has not made a public statement due to the gag order, but in court filings, the state acknowledged that avoiding years of uncertainty and securing guaranteed life sentences for the defendant could be seen as a just outcome. The victims' families, who were consulted via the prosecutor's office, gave their reluctant blessing to the deal, according to reports. Though some family members clearly wanted to pursue the death penalty, they also understood that accepting a plea would bring swift and certain justice, and spare them from reliving the gruesome details at trial and the likely appeals. Indeed, as one legal commenter noted, they're getting a conviction right away, and the absolute guarantee of life behind bars without parole, potentially saving the family's decades of anguish. With the guilty plea entered, the focus now turns to the sentencing phase. Judge Hippler scheduled a sentencing hearing for July 23, 2025 in Ada County Court. That proceeding is expected to last only one day. It will give the slain students' families and loved ones an opportunity to deliver victim impact statements in open court, their first chance to directly address Bryan Kohberger and the court about the pain and loss that he caused. These statements could be very emotionally charged and heart-wrenching, as the parents and siblings of Madison, Kaylee, Xana, and Ethan describe who their loved ones were and how their murders devastated so many lives. Kohberger himself will be offered a chance to speak if he so wishes, though it is unclear if he will choose to say anything beyond what he's already admitted. At the sentencing hearing, Judge Hippler will formally impose the agreed-upon punishment. Barring any last-minute surprises, Kohberger will be sentenced to life imprisonment without parole on each of the 4 murder counts to be served one after the other, plus a 10-year term for burglary. In effect, it is a sentence of life behind bars with no possibility of release or reduction. The chapter of legal proceedings will close with that sentence. Afterward, Kohberger will be transferred into the custody of the Idaho Department of Corrections to begin serving his time, likely in the maximum security wing of the Idaho State Correctional Institution or another appropriate facility for a convicted quadruple murderer. And because he waived his appeal rights, the case will not drag on in the higher courts as many death penalty cases do. There will be no appellate litigation or retrials barring some extraordinary development. This stands in contrast to what would have been likely decades of appeals had he been convicted at trial and sentenced to death. This swift resolution brings relief in that sense. Still, some matters remain. In the immediate aftermath of the plea, the media coalition has urged the court to lift the long-standing gag order, arguing that with no trial pending, Kohberger's right to an impartial jury is no longer at stake. As noted, Judge Hippler kept the gag in place through sentencing at the prosecution's request, but he has scheduled a hearing for July 17th to consider the media's motion to vacate it. But until the court rules otherwise, the cone of silence remains. I'm sure we'll be discussing some of those hearings in the weeks ahead. While certain facets of the story remain unexplained or unresolved, we can at least rest assured that the stories of the murdered University of Idaho students will soon be fully resolved.